All right, guys, we're gonna talk about time management when it comes to hunting big game animals. Don't turn it off. I know that sounds like a crazy, boring subject matter. And honestly, I've been trying to figure out some hook that's gonna convince you guys to watch this video, some creative way to get you interested in this topic. I can't come up with a solution other than telling you this, that if you embrace this and you're disciplined about it, you're gonna kill way more elk, way more deer, way more bears on public land. I have a ton of videos on this channel that I would call the blocking and tackling of Western big game hunting, right? So the wind, right? You have to understand how scent works. You have to understand how thermals work in the mountains and how these big game species, particularly elk and mule deer, use those in every aspect of their life, right? I've got a video on it. Check it out right here. I'll stick a link up. But the thing about that type of skill set, the reality is researching them, watching my videos, that's great. And it's a great way for you to cut down the learning curve in terms of how long it takes you to learn those. But those skill sets, you will learn over time by just being in the field also, even if you didn't watch any of my YouTube. The reason that concepts like time management are so interesting to me is that I've been blessed to see this giant data set of public land hunters over my career as a guide and outfitter, right? Way more than 1,000 hunters I've dealt with. One thing I have noticed is that once they get some experience and they kind of know all the tactical stuff, there's still this huge differentiation between successful folks and unsuccessful folks. Obviously, you want to be in the former, right? These topics, things like time management, are what make the big difference. Knowing exactly when to be glassing, exactly when to be stalking, and exactly how to plan your hunts around that. This is a huge one, guys. I know it sounds boring, but if you want to kill more stuff, bear with me and power through this. Let's dive right into it. All right, guys, so I wanted to mention that I'm having these custom skinning knives made. These are called Cliff Skinner. I've got a whole bunch of reasons why I've had this knife made the way that it's made. I've got a short video on the website. The details are there. Pursuitwithcliff.com. Click in the corner up by shop. You'll see Cliff Skinner. Click that puppy. You'll get all the details. All right, so the first thing you gotta understand is that every big game species, really all prey species in general, when a predator shows up, and this could be a person during hunting season, it could be a lion moving in the area, it could be a pack of wolves, all these big game animals do the same thing. They change their behavior so those predators can't find them and can't kill them. But a lot of the common knowledge that you hear out there is based on this idea that they move to remote areas. Bull elk go to the nastiest shit they can find. Once they're pressured, they go to private land. And yes, that's a mechanism they will use, but the actual primary mechanism that these animals use is to limit their exposure temporarily in terms of time, right? So they know they're susceptible when they're out during daylight hours feeding, right? Or they know they're susceptible when they move from bedding areas to water. So what they do first, before they move to remote areas or nasty terrain, the first thing they do is shrink the period of time that they're exposed. The reason I know this is the primary mechanism is I have been in situations several times where I'm guiding archery elk hunts on the public land wilderness area, right? And I've been guiding in that pressured environment, and then the next week I go to a private ranch that's right nearby. It could be the same geography, it's right nearby, and it really has basically the same density of elk on it as the public land. The first thing I notice, and it is stark, the very first thing I notice when I go from the public land to the private land is that all of a sudden the elk that I had been trying to glass up in the morning, where I only had 15-20 minutes of them actively being out there feeding, now all of a sudden on the private land I've got 2, 3, 4 hours of being able to glass them up. And sure, intertwined in that during archery season is that rutting activity is expanded too, right? They're out rutting not just the first 30, 40 minutes of daylight, they might be out there for 3 hours on the private land. So that's exactly what I'm seeing, is that once they know there's a bunch of pressure around, a bunch of hunting pressure, they tighten up those time frames where they're susceptible. Because of this, whenever you start hunting a heavily pressured game species on public land, the first thing you want to do, your number one priority, is to figure out the exact time frames when these animals are susceptible to getting glassed up and to you stalking them. It's actually fairly easy to figure this out. After a few days in the field, you'll figure it out. But also, if you just do some research, it'll be very apparent to you. On some species, it's really quite obvious and really quite simple. You know, if you take most of the mountain species that you guys are hunting, mule deer and elk, out in Colorado, Wyoming, places where they're getting a lot of hunting pressure in those mountain environments, what you're gonna see is they're gonna feed and be susceptible to you finding them the first hour, hour and a half of the day, the last hour, hour and a half at night. And I'm talking right against the dark, right? So from dark, your first shooting light, you got an hour, hour and a half on average. And we're talking first, second, third rifle season. Until there's big migratory snows or crazy frigid temps, that's what you're looking at. It'll adjust a little bit, just, you know, relative temperatures. If it's, you know, unseasonably warm, that'll tighten up a little bit. If it's unseasonably cold, it'll broaden out a little bit. And the reason for that is just because, and I've actually got a video on it, like, you know, how weather and temperatures affect these species. I'll stick a link up here for you. But the short and sweet of it is, it's a metabolism thing, right? Yes, the species, the game animal, it knows that you're hunting, it knows that there's a lot of hunting pressure in the area, but its metabolism is going to force it to be exposed for longer periods of time if it's colder, if it's harder to get to feed because of snowpack. So that's where you get a little elasticity to those time frames. But other species are going to be a little more interesting to figure out. A good example of this would be high country mule deer. So deer above timberline before they shed their velvet. Really, you know, right at light, it can be harder to glass them up in the mountains because you don't have any sunlight opening up the country. Yes, they'll be out feeding a little bit, but a lot of times they'll be feeding, you know, right at light, close to cover. It's hard to glass them up, but they become very susceptible whenever the sun comes up above the ridge line and starts to open up the basin. And all of a sudden you have what I call the shadow line. You could call it the sun line. Shadow that the sun is, you know, basically dissipating. It starts to move across the face. And what happens is those deer will bed in their first bedding spot. And then as the sun pops up, it'll open it up and no longer will they be in the shade. And so when the sun hits them, they'll move once or twice to their final bedding spot. So in this case, that's when they're compressing that time, right? They're waiting for the sun to hit them. And then right when it hits them, they'll move quickly because they know they're exposed during that period of time. So you factor that in, you learn that behavior, and now you can key in on that, right? And the reality is it's even more complicated, you know, in that example, not to dive too deep, but it's actually, there's a period of time there where it's very easy to glass them, but it's not actually the same period of time where it's really easy to kill them, because when they're moving with that shade line, it's kind of unpredictable where they're going to be, so you really don't want to attempt stalks during that period of time. You want to catch them moving or you want to glass them up, right? Because that's when they're moving a bunch. You want to do your stalks, you know, right after that third time they've bedded, where they're going to be for a longer period of time. It's usually a spot that stays shaded for a long period of time, if not the rest of the day. When they get there and you followed them there because you spotted them when they were moving, that's where you want to stalk them and kill them. So that species has a little bit different dynamic in this regard. I don't want to dive like crazy deep into every species, but the last one I'll leave you with is spring bears, right? Doesn't matter where you're at. I've hunted them. I've been in bear camps from northern British Columbia all the way down to New Mexico. And in general, and this applies to spring and fall, in general, 95+% of bears are killed 2 hours before it gets dark in the afternoon, right? So that's another one of those situations where that's the time that they've compressed most of their movement to. For bears, because they go into such thick stuff, that tends to also be when they're susceptible to getting stalked. So all of that is stuff you can figure out, and different species are going to be different. But my point is that you've got to figure out that small period of time, and you have to be religious about planning around that small period of time. This is the first area where hunters' brains get them astray, right? They don't realize how important those periods of time are relative to the rest of the time they're up there in the mountains as hunters. It is gigantic. The way that I would explain it, where it might, you know, get burnt into your brain, is that if somebody came to me, the queen of the mountains came to me and said, "Hey, Cliff, look, you're spring bear hunting, and you have two options. You can hunt the last 20 minutes of the day, or you can hunt from 10 o'clock to 5 o'clock. You can hunt those 7 hours. Hands down, I would take the last 20 minutes over 7 hours midday. Absolutely, 100% of the time. And for all these species, depending on that period of time when they're susceptible, that's what I would choose strategically. And man, if you don't embrace that, you're gonna make the wrong decision. All right, so I'm assuming that some of you guys are screaming at the video right now going, yeah, this is obvious stuff, Cliff. Everybody does that. No, they don't. I can tell you that. I have went in and packed in to hundreds of drop camps, and I've gone into them 30 minutes before shooting light in the afternoon, and half the time, half the hunters are already back at the campfire. So just empirically, people don't do this. I've seen this on so many hunts. The other thing you see that's not quite as obvious, but you particularly see it on backpack hunts, is you see people moving their camps during prime hours. This is just as bad. This is just as bad as going back to camp during the prime hours during a hunt, right? If you're moving your camp, you know, kind of the overarching logistical planning you're doing, if that's eating up your prime times, it's killing your hunt success. So an example of this would be people have a poor morning on a backpack hunt, and then they go back to camp, and then at 2 o'clock they decide, okay, we're gonna move basin. So they pack their stuff up at 2, they hike out, so they lose all those afternoon prime hours, and then the next morning they lose all the morning prime hours too. So they've lost a huge chunk of effective time because that's when they're planning to move. What you want to do if you want to move, the ideal situation is you've glassed in the morning, you haven't found elk, you're an hour and a half in, you're, maybe 2 hours in, and you're like, there's no elk in here, we're making a call, and then you're leaving then. You're leaving at 9 o'clock, 9:30 in the morning, and you've gotten into your new basin by 5:30 in the afternoon. So you're gonna pick up that good afternoon prime time. Plan accordingly around those prime hours or you're killing your hunt. Those are the two scenarios. The obvious one, people just coming home too early, leaving too late in the morning. And then the latter one, just screwing up your logistics where it overlaps with your prime times. We have got to figure out why people are doing it so you can avoid it. The first reason that I have found on why people do this, the mentality of a lot of hunters right now. And some of this is in the culture of hunting, and I'll have to get in deep before you guys fret and holler at me about it. But this concept of I hunt all day, I'm always hunting, this is an asinine way of thinking about hunting, and it's not reality, okay? It's really the mark of a naive hunter. I'm not saying that fitness out there is not important, because it is important. It makes it quicker to move camps. It makes it easier to implement stocks. It makes you way more agile and effective in the mountains. Absolutely. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a mentality that I'm hunting all the time. All that mentality does is hurt you as a hunter. Because if you look at any other species of predator, and I'm not trying to get, woo-woo or weird on this, it's just a fact. If you look at lions, wolves, any of that stuff, they hunt in a precise way, in a sprinting type of way. And I mean that figuratively, right? They're not out there just, there's not a big ultra marathon to them. Hunting isn't, right? And these are animals that are depending on killing these same species that we're hunting. What they do is they focus their efforts on those prime times when the animals are susceptible. The reason they do that is hunting and finding game and stalking game takes all your focus, right? All your brain power. It's exactly like sitting down at a cubicle and crunching intense mathematical equations in a spreadsheet. You have to have all your brain power in a focus to be effective on it and make the proper choices during those activities. If you're glassing, you've got to focus. If you're on a stalk, you've got to focus. You got to be using all your senses. It's very important. And the reason I alluded to like the cubicle idea and that analogy is there's actually been a ton of studies on that, like work productivity and effectiveness, right? People who are having to use all their brain and focus it. And what they find is the exact same dynamic. A bunch of people say, oh, I can work 14 hours a day. I can do math equations in Excel 15 hours a day. There's a bunch of people believe that. They tell researchers that. But then when they actually study these people and observe these people and they look at their productivity and effectiveness, on average, they're only effective 2 to 3 hours a day. At max, 5 or 6. There's tons of study, it's been repeated over and over. This applies to hunting also. You can think that I'm gonna hunt all day, including the prime time, and I'm gonna be effective and on point the whole time, but the evidence says you can't do that. Our brains don't work that way, and like I said, you can look at all the other predators out there in the woods. They don't operate that way. Don't convince yourself that you can do that. Obviously, the downside if you do that is it dulls everything. And then just because of the different time periods, I see this all the time. You know, we go out, we're pretty effective in the morning. Before dark, we're at our glassing spot. We glass hard in the morning. And then instead of going back to camp and dealing with other stuff, letting our eyes take a break, we decide that we're gonna hunt for another 5 or 6 hours. We're just gonna keep glassing, glass through time that, you know, is not prime time at all. And then you go into the afternoon hunt and you start getting through it. You get to the last hour a day. You're kind of wary. It's hard to glass anymore. Your brain's just not on point. And then you end up magically back at camp 30 minutes before dark, right? That happens to everybody. The other big reason why I think this is all too common, people not being out there during the prime hours and focus on those prime hours, is they do end up being on the ends of the days. And we all live in this, you know, civilized world that doesn't operate that way. We wind down at the end of the day, and then in the morning, you know, we get up slowly, you know, we wake up with coffee, a commute, whatever. There's kind of this civilized approach to life. We also sleep in one big chunk at night. So when you go into the mountains as a hunter, that falls over. It takes a while to break that cycle. There's this constant pull for you to get back to that, right? So, you know, you're sitting there at night, you're glassing, there's 20 minutes of light left to glass. This is the prime time. This is when the spring bears move. This is when you need to be on point watching, but there's this pull to get back to camp because you know, hey, I want to get my 7 hours of sleep tonight. So my recommendation here is the first couple days you get into the mountains, break that routine as much as you can. Just don't worry about a big chunk of sleep at night. Just consider that naps midday are gonna be a part of your hunt, and break that routine right off the bat. It'll benefit you greatly, particularly during long day hunts. So spring bear hunting, archery, elk hunting, just figure that, hey, I'm no longer in the civilized world. I've got to break up that routine so I can focus on hunting those prime hours. So that means getting up ass early, getting home way late, but you got to get up early again, and then midday, take a 3 or 4 hour nap. Now that's very hard because it involves breaking this routine, but I think that is why people are constantly battling this and they don't end up hunting those prime times. So I think those are the primary reasons why people are not hunting during the right times. But the last one, I think there is something to, and that's that a lot of folks are just scared of the dark. They don't like, you know, navigating and covering ground in the dark for whatever reason. I don't think it's that they're scared of like monsters or whatever, anything like that. I think a lot of it has to do with just navigation. They're just worried. They're constantly having to look at their onX because they don't have landmarks. So I think people in a sense are afraid of the dark in that way. The only way to combat that is just get used to it and get over it. And you can have, you know, some backup to your navigation if you're really worried about that. Have something beyond onX, have a GPS watch, something else that gives you some backup. Make sure you have extra lights, you know, 2 headlamps, extra batteries, and just having that and knowing you have that, for a lot of folks, that'll make them much more comfortable moving around in the dark. All right, so let's take a moment and dig into the exact results for folks that don't key in on hunting these prime times. The obvious result is that you're just less likely to find game, right? I've seen it with my own eyes. I'm talking about packing in people who have been hunting elk for 20 or 30 years and then down the drainage, packing in another group of individuals that have only been hunting for 3 or 4 years, but they have this time management concept under control. I've seen it year over year. That group that focuses on the time management and they're always out there during the prime time, they're gonna kill 3, 4, 5 times as many elk. That's the obvious one, right? But there's a couple other big, massive downsides that are not so obvious. The first one is just taking care of yourself and taking care of camp. If you go watch my video on why hunters quit, I'll stick a link up here, you're gonna see that from my observations, hunters don't quit for a lot of the reasons that people think. And a lot of times it's not even the reasons that the hunters who quit think. A lot of times they'll justify something about how they've got a family thing going on or a business thing, or they just don't have the time to be there right now. They really need to be home. They have these other responsibilities. They manifest these things. When you really dig deep, it has to do with a lack of sleep, a lack of, eating a proper diet. Those sort of things come deep into play. And if you're trying to go out there right off the bat for the first 3, 4, 5 days or the whole hunt, try to hunt all day long, you're like a rabbit out there just running around with anxiety, all those things become much bigger issues. So if you can key in on the prime times and make that the priority, and then be taking care of those other factors, getting some sleep midday, making sure that your diet is taken care of, making sure that camp chores are taken care of. So yes, even your sleep at night is longer duration. That's something I can't believe people do. I cannot tell you how many times, particularly in the afternoons, they'll get into the prime hours and they'll be far away from camp because the glassing spot or a bear or deer they saw the day before is pretty darn far away from camp. And they're sitting there and they realize it's gonna take me 2 hours to get back to camp. I don't have firewood cut at camp. I don't have my meal ready to cook at camp. I don't have all that stuff done. So now, if I wait until dark, get through these prime hours, I still got to hike all the way back there 2 hours, and then I got another hour and a half of firewood and all this sort of things, and that is going to eat up their sleep. And that's a rational thing to think about, but you can take care of that during the non-prime hours. I'm so surprised how few people plan their hunts around the effective hours of the day, and therefore they're just hunting all the time, and then their whole trip crashes, and it ends up being a situation where they quit early for all the reasons that I talk about in that video, right? Basically, you're not taking care of yourself, and that runs you down and you quit. So that's another issue with not focusing on, specific moments during the hunt when game is the most susceptible. The third issue, and this is the most sneaky without a doubt, is attribution. So a lot of people, because they're not hunting the prime times, what they do is they get incorrect data. So when we're out hunting, we're collecting data on the area. Year to year we do this, but even within a specific hunt. And that data is hugely important, because it's gonna tell us if we should move spots completely, if we should stick it out here, should we bear the logistical time to move to another spot, the logistical energy to move to another spot, or are we better off staying here? Next year, should we hunt this area or should we hunt a different area? And if you're not hunting the prime times that animals are susceptible, the data you get in that regard is damn near worthless. The data you get during the prime times is what matters. So if I go into a good area that looks like great habitat for bears, but I spend some time during the prime time and I don't find a bear, that's way more valuable information rather than looking at an area for 6 or 7 hours outside of prime time, right? During midday. People will go glass a spot or even try to still hunt a spot, look for tracks in a spot during the off hours. They'll be like, I spent 6, 7 hours in there, I didn't see anything. And then they'll just mark that spot off. Well, that's poor attribution. You're not correlating the effectiveness of the time with the actual data that you're getting in the field, right? Obviously, if you've got extra time during the day, go out, glass some timber, glass some low potential stuff. If it's, in the off hours, go do that if you have time and you've taken care of yourself. But don't take that data, that experience, and equate it to prime time data. You'll make all sorts of horrible decisions. And I saw this dynamic a ton amongst my clients over the years, because what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll be hunting in the non-prime hours, and they draw conclusions that there's no elk in this area. And once they draw that conclusion that there's no elk in the area, they'll do one of two things. They'll quit, or they'll start going way out of the area and wasting their energy. And when they do that, their issue with not being there during the prime hours gets even worse, particularly with elk hunting, because now in order to get to this further area that they want to hunt, because there's no area, there's no elk around them because they already chalked that off because they glassed it from 10 o'clock to 5 o'clock at night and they didn't see any elk, so there's no way they're there. Now they're going to a further area, which means they're hunting even less prime hours due to all the reasons that I talked about. So you just have to be very cautious about that and make sure that you're doing proper attribution as it relates to actually equating the information you get when the animals are susceptible to you finding them. All right, so I give you little tips and tricks on this journey through this concept, but I will touch on something a little bit tactical here. So let's talk about this effectiveness component of this, right? A lot of you guys are gonna wanna glass outside of the, these little periods of time where glassing is the most effective. I get that, but my recommendation is adjust the strategy that you're using based on the time of day. Let's take the situation where I am archery elk hunting, haven't found any elk yet. I'm in a heavily pressured area, big wilderness area, covered in ground, glassing at prime spots, right? So I'm there in the dark at the glassing spot, right as the sun comes up, right as the elk are moving around. I'm glassing in a particular way. And what I'm doing is I am glassing more rapidly and less just sitting there detailed, looking for an antler, looking for an ear, twitching, looking for a tail twitching. I'm doing less of that, and I'm doing more, not rapid, but quicker scanning. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm moving positions a whole lot more, right? I am taking my actual tripod and I'm moving to a different angle several times during this period of time at a much faster rate than I would outside of the prime time. And the reason is that game is easier to find during that period of time, and I need to cover as much ground as possible with my glass during that first 30 minutes to an hour and a half, because that's when I'm gonna primarily see game. There's a cost to being real slow and meticulous, and so I adjust my glassing accordingly. The goal of your glassing is to cover more ground during those prime times. Now, if you want to glass outside of that, you've taken care of everything else, I'm going to expand my hunting opportunities just by volume a little bit. That makes sense. During those period of times, you can do a different style of glassing. Like you can do a lot of short range glassing. I've got a video on that. I'll stick it up right here. You can check that out. But that sort of glassing is, real slow and meticulous. And honestly, it's less fatiguing. If I'm looking, just at a big aspen flat that's between, 300 and 800 yards away from me, and I'm just casually moving my binoculars on my tripod or my spotter on my tripod slightly and just looking in there, for a little twitch, for a little movement, I can look a little bit, I can let my eyes rest. We're not in a big hurry. The game is not going to get up and feed off somewhere else. I'm not missing another spot. I'm just meticulously going through that. That's the type of glassing you want to do in those off hours. The other real low-key glassing strategy you can use midday, if there's snow on the ground for mule deer, elk hunting, you can start glassing for tracks midday. You can do this without binoculars, that sort of thing. You can just do a lot of kind of glassing with your bare eyes, and then when you're glassing in the binoculars, you're just looking for tracks. That's real low-key glassing. You can do it during the day, and it's going to give you pretty good information even though it's in the off hours. So you can develop strategies within your tactics that take advantage of this dynamic. I know this is getting a little bit abstract, but I'm telling you, if you think about it, you're going to be amazed how much more effective you are. So just think about, even within your skill sets, how you're going to adjust them during prime hours and during off hours. And this whole dynamic plays in when you're actually choosing to make a stock. You're going to push it on these elk. You don't know if they're going to be there tomorrow, and you don't know if you can kill them tonight because of shooting light. You just might not have enough time. But if you think about prime hours and prime units of hunts, like, okay, I've got one full day of hunting left, but really I only have the morning hunt and the afternoon hunt. So I've got these short periods of time. A lot of times that is going to help you make better decisions in the moment, whether to do a stock or not. So getting in this mentality will help on that front also. All right, so that's it. That's time management in a little package for you. Think about it and be disciplined on it in your future hunts, and I guarantee you're gonna be more successful. This one was really difficult for me to get through because I feel like I had to get into the nitty gritty. Even though a lot of this seems so obvious, I had to tear it apart because I just see it is low-hanging fruit out there. There's so many people not considering these aspects of their hunts, and they make shit choices, and that results in no dead animals, right? And they do it year over year. So even though this might have been brutal to watch, I guarantee that if you just let it entrench in your brain and you're disciplined about this stuff, you're gonna have way more success. If this was valuable to you, do me a huge favor, like it, subscribe to the channel, check this video out. I'll put right here. It's on common game violations that folks make. Another one that if you watch it, internalize it, you can avoid a big pain in your ass. So go check that out. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you later.